So, a couple of days ago, an investigative outlet called Dropside News put out this really long, really detailed piece on the state of the US Pakistani relationship. And the article covers a lot of ground, and the Imran Khan ouster, the Iran mediation stuff, the whole geopolitical arc. But buried inside was this one claim that I think, at least it caught my attention. I think it caught quite a few other people's attention as well. And that was that Pakistan had reportedly asked China during bilateral talks in 2024 over, a potential Chinese military base at Gwadar for help with acquiring a nuclear second strike capability. So in other words, Pakistan asked China to help it with building a sea-based nuclear deterrent. So in practical terms, I think what this means is Pakistan basically asked for either a nuclear-powered submarine or the technology and help to build one. And according to the same report, China basically said no, citing that their own non-proliferation commitments and strategic risk it would create for Beijing. So now we don't have official confirmation from either side. But what I want to unpack from this is because, if you've been following Pakistan's, defense trajectory, especially on the naval side, this report makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of, there's a bit of a trail of evidence, which I think it's worth walking through. So let's start with what we actually know. The first clear on the record sign that Pakistan was pursuing a sea-based nuclear capability came in January 2017, when ISPR, the military's public affairs arm, announced the successful test of the Babur III submarine launched cruise missile. This described it as a 450-kilometer range, submarine launched cruise missile (SLCM) launched from an underwater mobile platform. And the key line, the one that really matters, is that ISPR at the time explicitly framed the Babur III as the solution that would provide a credible second strike capability. That was their quotes, basically. So, that was the first time a official Pakistani institution directly linked, the sea-launched weapon with a nuclear second strike role. The second test of the Babur III followed roughly a year later in March 2018, and collectively, these tests likely established that Pakistan could, at some level, deliver a nuclear warhead from a submerged platform. So on paper, if you have like a checklist, technically Pakistan developed a sea-based nuclear strike capability. But here's the thing. Since those two tests back in 2017-2018, there has been no further Babur III test. None. At least nothing that has been publicly disclosed. And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, because if this was a priority program moving at pace, you would expect to see continued testing, integration trials with the Hangors, maybe extended range variants and what have you, that kind of thing, but silence. So fast forward to 2024, so about 2 years ago, where this report, the Dropside report, is basically saying this meeting between Pakistan and China had happened. Well, interestingly, around that time, there was a program on PTV where they'd basically interviewed two retired Pakistani Navy officials, so Vice Admiral Ahmed Saeed and Rear Admiral Salim Akhtar. And they discussed basically the Hangor-class submarines and their role in Pakistan's, wider deterrence posture. And Admiral Saeed made this really interesting distinction. He described the Hangors as playing a hybrid piece. So basically a compromise between a purely conventional attack submarine and a nuclear-powered boat. He acknowledged that the Hangor would provide a potential second strike capability, but, and this was a critical part, he said that it would fall short of delivering an assured second strike capability. And then he went on to further say that the Pakistan Navy should gradually build towards an assured capability, meaning, what he's implying is that the Pakistan Navy should eventually develop, a nuclear-powered submarine, an SSN, or ideally an SSBN, a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. Now, think about what he's saying here. He's saying, yes, we have the Babur III. It could potentially be integrated to the Hangor-class. It can give you a technical second strike capability. So you can, again, you can tick the checkbox. But does a 450-kilometer cruise missile launched from a conventional submarine genuinely deter India? I mean, a country that's building actual SSBNs with 3,500-kilometer range SLBM, so submarine launched ballistic missiles. Like, that's a fundamentally different level of capability. And every single country that has taken on a sea-based nuclear deterrence capability in seriousness, the US, the Russians, the British, the French, the Chinese, and now the Indians, they all sort of coalesced and concluded that, a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, or at least a nuclear-powered submarine, was necessary. Every single one of them, no exception. So what these retired officials from the Pakistan Navy were saying in 2024 was basically, look, the hybrid approach that we could attain, this is where it's important, I want to put that caveat there, that could, it might not actually do it, is that it's a stepping stone at best. And here's where my own assessment comes in. So again, it's just an assessment. You can take it or leave it. But I think the Pakistan Navy has actually started walking back the whole hybrid concept. And the reason is not because the idea was technically bad. It's because it creates a massive problem for everything else the Pakistan Navy is trying to do. So right now, the Pakistan Navy is heavily focused on building up its conventional submarine force. You've got the Hangor-class submarine coming in from China. You've got the shallow water attack submarine program in the works, where companies like Italy's Fincantieri and Turkey's STM, they've been competing for it. Beyond those specific programs, the Pakistan Navy has an overarching goal to become a submarine building navy. So meaning they want to reach a point, as they have with the Jinnah-class frigate, for example, they want to reach a point where they're eventually designing and producing their own submarine, right? Their own original platform. So to get there, you need foreign partners, right? And the problem is, if your submarine program is even remotely associated with a nuclear weapons capability, those partners are going to have issues working with you. But for sure, the European ones would potentially just walk away entirely. They don't want to necessarily participate in something that could implicate them in nuclear proliferation, full stop. And this is something that, at a broader theme of Pakistan's defense programs, it's something that Arslan and Asim on the Defense Uncut podcast, they've been bringing up quite regularly. The point is that, you establish a line between your conventional and your nuclear systems. So you basically say, look, we're developing an entire family, an entire platform of conventional only weapons. They will not bleed over into the nuclear role. And then we have, for the nuclear stuff, a completely separate family. So that's where you have, for example, the Fatah, surface missile programs. You have the Thermur air-launched cruise missile, and so on. So I think what's happening here at a much more industrial level, you could say the Pakistan Navy is drawing a very firm line. They're saying potentially the Hangor-class and any future conventional submarine, it will not be used for nuclear purposes. In fact, these submarines will just stick to their conventional anti-ship and anti-submarine roles entirely. And that would also, I would imagine, in my personal assessment, that would also preclude the Pakistan Navy, or basically stop them from even investing in things like a vertical launch system, or those very dedicated land attack capabilities for their submarines. Because right now they're really focused on the idea that, okay, we want to leverage our submarines for the anti-ship and anti-submarine warfare roles. We want to build our conventional deterrence capability, basically. And that means, as a consequence, that the entire nuclear mission, it gets separated out of this entire stack completely. It becomes its own parallel program, with its own purpose-built platform, ideally a nuclear-powered platform. It's interesting that, this interview happened with PDV in 2024, around the time the Dropside News basically said Pakistan went to China and requested for help, meaning that we had a very clear potential indication here between these two things, that the Pakistan Navy went to China and said, can you help us build this dedicated nuclear capability, completely parallel to what we want to do conventionally? And that's why, I think going forward, I think any serious talk about a sea-based nuclear attack capability from Pakistan will specifically be tied to a nuclear-powered submarine, not a conventional boat with nuclear-capable cruise missiles. I mean, yes, technically it's possible, right? Technically. But I think on these matters, I think the Pakistan Navy really wants to walk back that technicality and hybrid stuff and, maintain two parallel families. I think, we've seen with even on the land side of the equation with, the Army establishing Army Rocket Force Command as a purely conventional capability force. And then separately to that, parallel to that, you have the Strategic Plans Division, which deals with the nuclear stuff. So I think a very similar approach is being taken here. Because once you start muddying those waters, it becomes both a, obviously a policy level strategic problem where, when you're trying to get partners to help you on with helping you with designing an original submarine, or helping you with, for example, even the technology transfer to potentially manufacture a submarine, especially the upstream components for that, like the steel, for example. If those two waters get mixed, those partners will not work with you, basically. So now that being said, let's say the Pakistan Navy wants a nuclear-powered submarine or tries building one, how will it pursue that? So obviously, that is far from easy. That would be probably the most difficult component of Pakistan's strategic efforts to date, I would argue. So, a nuclear power submarine, it needs a compact naval reactor, basically. It needs a purpose-built hull designed for nuclear-related operations. It needs things like shock hardening, propulsion integration, and obviously the full weapons stack, which would include your submarine-launched cruise missiles and eventually, submarine-launched ballistic missile system. And then you need to test all of it, validate it, and sustain it over the life of the program. Not only is that costly, it's very high risk. A lot can go wrong, and that can completely scuttle the entire program if you don't have enough funding to back it up. And that's where, you would imagine the scenarios where the Pakistan Navy would just approach the Chinese and say, can you just provide us with something? And obviously, if the drop side reporting is correct, if it is accurate, I think, again, we can never say it's 100% on point, but I think there are a lot of surrounding context and signs, and if you connect the different dots together, you could potentially see it being somewhat accurate, basically. Now, with all that said, I do want to make one point, though. It's worth noting that Pakistan, it does have relevant expertise here. So the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, PAEC, they've designed and built nuclear reactors. I mean, the Khashab series production reactors. They've also helped with, the civilian reactors like the Chashma and Karachi stuff. So, and obviously also around 7-8 years ago, PAEC also submitted a proposal to develop small modular reactors, which would potentially be a stepping stone towards developing a miniature reactor for naval purposes. So it tells you that they're already thinking about compact reactor technology. And they have a real scientific and there's a real R&D foundation for atomic stuff within Pakistan. And for those of you who have listened to our Defense Uncut podcast, you will know that we can be very critical of institutions like NASTAP and NESCOM, and we can be very aggressive in our criticisms about the Pakistani military leadership and what's indigenous and what's not. However, when we say, now with that context, when we're going out and saying that PAC is the real deal, that should carry some weight. And I would recommend, there are 2 books you can read that really help fill out those details. The first one is Eating Grass by General Feroz Khan, and the other one is Pakistan's Pathway to the Bomb by Mansoor Ahmed. Both books, excellent reads in terms of understanding the nuclear program, the history of the nuclear program, the contributions that PAC made in developing an indigenous fuel cycle for the Pakistani nuclear program, and also a very good read in understanding the nature of the Pakistani national security establishment, the bureaucracy, and all those, structural things that we sort of allude to in our podcast, but we don't spend a lot of time getting into in a lot of detail. I think those 2 will give you a pretty good, reasonable understanding of what's at play, basically. But, here's the reality. The 2 things that PAC would need to, would need in order to design a naval reactor. The first one is an enormous amount of funding and an enormous amount of sustained funding, not just, a one-off payment, but decades-long sustained, billions of dollars, basically. And the other thing is that Pakistan has in very short supply is basically time. So funding and time. You don't have a lot of funding and time. And then obviously from a material standpoint, access to uranium to obviously expand the nuclear program essentially and scale out these developments. So, this would be a massive multi-decade undertaking. You would need significant access towards things like, for example, uranium suppliers, critical supplies and critical inputs. Definitely you can produce some of that within Pakistan, but again, it was very difficult to even build the initial nuclear fuel cycle with what we had. So you can imagine this is a continuation of that effort. So it requires basically national security leadership that's willing to execute and be in that, very, let's say, intense environment and be able to withstand US pressure when that starts knocking on our door, basically. So now with all this being said, here's where I think, the drop site reporting basically slots in terms of the bigger picture. So just to summarize, the PN, the Pakistan Navy, has firewalled its conventional submarine program from its nuclear mission. And the only path that the Pakistan Navy has set itself in order to acquire a genuine sea-based deterrent capability is through a separate dedicated program, completely in parallel. I think there might even one day potentially come out and say that, they might not say it because they would want to keep some level of ambiguity so that there's some level of deterrence, I guess, effect. But I think at some point it'll become clear where they'll say, look, at the end of the day, especially if they get close to a program, I think that's where that would be a pretty interesting sign. Like if, one sign that the Pakistan Navy getting close to a nuclear submarine would be that one day they come out and say any, sea-based deterrence capability will have to run through a nuclear powered boat, basically. And I think that would be a pretty good sign that they're getting closer to one. And, within that framework, one might basically say that, okay, well, in that case, China would be a natural partner, right? So obviously they're helping Pakistan build a Hangor-class submarine. And obviously the Chinese have vast experience at this point with both nuclear-powered boats and nuclear-powered, boats with ballistic missiles, basically. So again, the idea that Pakistan at one point had asked China for help in this area is not surprising. I think it makes complete sense. But, whether Pakistan asked for a deployable submarine, something that's ready to go, or some very critical assistance, in either scenario, China said no. And that's also worth unpacking why. So here's where things stand right now. And obviously, I don't think this is where the story ends. I think the story is going to be ongoing. But there are some structural shifts that are happening within the wider region that could basically help impact things in the Pakistan Navy's favor. The first is, the US-led rules-based order. A system that has basically governed those very strict non-proliferation norms and export controls and rules, and basically helped sort of define the security architecture within South Asia and the Middle East. It is showing signs of strain. Whether it's eroding or evolving, with the US maybe delegating more of the ownership of managing security and stability to regional actors, that remains to be seen. But it is definitely not the same regime that has existed in the past, let's say 30, 40 years. And the point is that, this kind of framework, when it evolves and changes, it could push some very key regional actors towards a certain direction. So, for example, if you look around the region, you'll see Turkey. I think they've been very brazen about their ambitions for nuclear capabilities. I think, with them literally saying that they want nuclear-powered submarines, with them literally developing an ICBM, I think, they're not being very subtle about it. Saudi Arabia has its own concerns regarding Iran and has voiced interest in nuclear technology. These are very significant players, and in their own different ways, they could be willing to push their own boundaries, provided things that previously guaranteed the security basically start changing. If the trust of these key players, both within Pakistan and outside of Pakistan, in the existing order continues to sort of erode, then Pakistan's prospect of securing a nuclear-powered boat may improve. And even Beijing, despite saying no 2 years ago, it might revisit its own position as well, because things have changed since 2024. Things have changed quite a bit. In 2024, it was the end of the, towards the end of the Biden era. I think at that point, even you could say that the US-led rules order, while maybe under a little bit of pressure, was still there. Now we're in a post, tariffs, post, direct regional war type situation with Iran and what have you. We have a US administration that has basically put a lot of, not just a lot, maybe all of its allies, traditional allies, under notice. And obviously China, in its own posture, might feel much more confident, right, moving forward as well. So with that, I would say the one thing left is basically the disposition and direction of Pakistan's own national security leadership. Are they willing to go back to the mentality, to the difficulties, to the single vision goal of eating grass? In this case, might be drinking salt water, basically, of producing or securing a nuclear-powered boat. Because that's the other part. You could also argue that part of Beijing's reluctance to even help Pakistan in 2024 was that they weren't sure, where does Pakistan sit? Like, what is Pakistan's purpose? What's with the hedging, right? What does the national security leadership want, right? Does it want to stand up to India? Does it want to, erode India's national interest in an active way? Has it shown signs of doing that? In the previous conflict between India and Pakistan, what they've noticed that, yes, you can argue that, yes, the Pakistan was under a lot of threat from India, sure. But, we can see from what happened with the Iran war that, even a very aggressive Indian-led shock would not necessarily displace Pakistan in its entirety. Far from it. And then, as the Chinese have done with the Iranians, there's a prospect the Chinese could also have done that with Pakistan, help them out in sustaining a long-term war. So, the reality is that the Chinese are looking at this as well from many different angles. It might not just be from the factor of, that they want to respect the US-led order, because I don't think these days they care about that. I think what they want to know is there like a wolf warrior within the Pakistan's national security leadership that's willing to now push those boundaries the way they did back in the 60s and 70s for the nuclear weapon program in the first place? Are they willing that when the US comes calling to show restraint, are they willing to go and say no back in 1998? Is that leadership there in the security leadership? And I think that's going to be the next question to probably follow. But anyways, that's where I'll leave it for today. If you found this useful, feel free to share your comments. Definitely give us a like and subscribe. We definitely appreciate all that. We'd love to get more subscribers onto this channel. I think from the perspective of both, Pakistani defense matters, and also in time, when we start expanding our coverage, I think we provide a unique and insightful take on a lot of things that you won't necessarily find elsewhere. So we'd love to spend more time and invest in more resources to make that happen. So once again, let us know. And I also recommend you visit the Kuwa website. Thank you. Take care and bye.